So,
Hi, Julia.
I think it's all systems go. So, good morning.
Great.
Good morning, everybody. Good
Hi,
morning.
everyone.
Good morning, Caroline, and welcome, everyone. It looks like women are still joining, so we'll be seeing the greetings coming in as we get started. So, just to let you know how we've decided to structure this session. I'm going to sort of be doing quite a bit of the chairing and just trying to, keep us to time. And Caroline is probably going to end up doing a bit more of the actual input on the text that she chose to, or well, that we've both chosen, but she was the one who suggested it on that text. So so that's how it's going to go. We're going to aim to finish our kind of presentation and discussion input by around about about 15 or 20 minutes from the end, and then hopefully have some time for discussion and definitely discussion with other participants who I imagine will have a lot to contribute. So I would just like to begin by welcoming Caroline. I'm not sure if this is the first of these that you've joined, Caroline.
It is. It's a complete pleasure, Julia, and hi, everyone. And I've noticed that we've got record numbers, so yeah, I can only put that down to Julia Long's presence here today. So thanks, everyone.
Definitely far too modest. It's definitely the premiere of the Caroline Norma input that is generated these numbers, I'm sure. So so anyway, I'll let you introduce yourself, Caroline. But just to say that what I do know is that you're a senior lecturer at what's it called again? Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology.
Is its flashy name, known as RMIT, and you can drop the R and just have MIT, and it sounds even better.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I know that along with, I think, a number of other speakers in this series, you had a great schooling in that you were the PhD student of Sheila Jeffries. So that's really fantastic to have you here, and I think there's quite a dynasty of you now, which is fantastic to hear. So but maybe would you like to say a little bit about yourself, Caroline, and your research interest before we actually get into the today's topic?
Oh, thanks, Julia. That's a very nice introduction, and I'm sure women are wanting to hear from you also for biography purposes and for things recently going on. So I'll leave a bit of time for that as well. But to mention, yes, so I teach in a translation and interpreting program, and with a focus on Japanese, but actually my research focus is on history. And I only mention that because that's part of the reason why I chose this book, which I'll talk about in a minute. My focus in writing history and researching history is on the prostitution systems that developed in modern Japan. So the idea is to investigate the development of these prostitution systems is not inevitable or natural, but actually requiring men to do a lot of work and innovation and renovation to the systems to keep them going throughout history. I've kind of noticed, and I'm sorry just to give a bit of a history little spiel here because it relates to what we'll talk about in the book, I think. So I think women might have already noticed that a lot of history books do address prostitution as their topic. But you also might notice that 99% of these, as far as I've found, all look at prostitution as symbolic of other historical changes. So changes in, one particular country's polity, or changes in urban development, or changes in approaches to public health. So they never approach prostitution in history as important in of itself and always as symbolic. So it's never the women that are of concern. It's actually the public policy in relation to prostitution that's always of concern. So historians like me, and there's others, turn this upside down, and we research prostitution not as symbolic, but actually as a driver of these other major changes that the historians are more interested in, things like changes in polity. So we see fundamentally women's sexual slavery as driving the trajectory of men's history. And that also does relate to today's book, so that's why I'm mentioning it. So yes, I've sort of researched things like how the connection between Japanese corporate practice and prostitution developed in modern history. It's a very historically contingent thing that these prostitution systems develop, I think. And so we need as feminists to investigate how men do it, what innovations they made, what kind of struggles against them did they face from women, and how did they overcome them? These kind of things, is sort of my focus anyway. So that, leads me today, and that's why I'm in Japan at the moment. The recent research project is about what Australia knew during the Second World War about the Japanese military sexual slavery system, which is kind of known as the comfort women system, people might hear of, where the Japanese military trafficked hundreds of thousands of women across Asia and Pacific during the Pacific War. So it's about what Australia knew about that system and how we responded to it. So that's kind of, from me, is my background.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you. It sounds such important work that you're doing, and I think, as you say, I think it's going to be very relevant to the kinds of things that we're looking at in terms of Showalter's text that we're looking at today. Do you have sorry, I should know this, but do you have a book that's available on this topic yet, or is it mainly academic papers? Because I'm sure there's going to be interest.
Oh, thanks. Oh, yeah. If any women wanted to read the Japanese sexual slavery book, it's got a longer title, but if you just Caroline Norma and Japanese sexual slavery, the book will come up. That's in 2015. It's also been translated into Korean, so it's got a wide audience there.
Right,
I think it's quite an accessible book. It's not an academic book. It's more of a it's an assessment of the Japanese military sexual scheme from the perspective of anti-prostitution ideology. So
Okay, fantastic. Thanks you.
Thanks
for telling us about that. So anyway, so today's book, I don't know if they always come out of the back to front. It looks like it's going to be back to front on here. Is The Female Malady: Women, Madness and English Culture, 1830 to 1980, and it's by Elaine Showalter. I'm just going to say give a little bit of biographical information about Elaine Showalter, and then I want to ask you why you chose this particular text to talk about. So Elaine Showalter probably is known, I imagine, is known to quite a few of our participants as a really world-renowned academic. She was born in America in 1940. She taught at Princeton from 1984 to 2003, and in addition to her extensive academic work, she also gained success and high regard as a media commentator and a public intellectual, both in the US and in the UK. She's still active as a writer and speaker today, and her most recent book in 2017 is a biography of the American suffragist and abolitionist Julia Ward Howe. Now, maybe I could say many years ago now, my BA originally was actually in English literature, so I was familiar with Elaine Showalter mainly in terms of her work of feminist literary criticism. And I remember that she pioneered these concepts of feminist critique and gynocritics. I remember reading all about that when I was studying sort of back in the 80s. But her work ranges across disciplines in terms of obviously literary studies, but also historical works. And some of her probably most acclaimed and noted works include The New Feminist Criticism, which she wrote which was published in 1985. Sexual Anarchy, Gender and Culture at the Fin de Siècle, which was published in 1990, and also quite a number of other texts, but also, of course, this book, The Female Malady, which I remember, I think it came out around about mid-80s.
Yep, 1985.
1985, yeah. So that's probably enough. People can, women can have a little Google and search around if they want more detail on Showalter. But if we could come on to why you chose it, because I must admit, when I saw this sort of suggestion on the list, I was really pleased, because I remember reading it years ago, probably around about 1990, something like that. But I was also a bit surprised, because maybe it's not what a text that I wouldn't necessarily have expected in a series that's about radical feminist texts. I wouldn't particularly think of Elaine Showalter as a radical feminist, although her work certainly, I think, falls into a category. She's got an analysis of patriarchy, and she's it's a very it's a very politically informed analysis of her topic of, you know, the ideas of women and madness over that kind of 150-year period. But I was, as I say, I was really pleased that you chose it, and a bit surprised. So maybe could you begin just by telling us why you chose this book in particular to talk about?
Yeah, you're right, Julia. I think, yeah, women would have expected Phyllis Chesler's Women and Madness from 1973 to be here tonight to be discussed. And indeed, there would be a lot of reason to discuss that book. Obviously, that book sold 3 million copies, apparently, which is just unimaginable for a feminist book, let alone a radical feminist one. So it's true, Phyllis Chesler almost owns this field in terms of analyses of the relationship between the history of psychiatry and women, and also the sort of conceptualisation of women as a class as mad. That book, though, yeah, I find it, I must admit, I find it a difficult book. I think I wouldn't be the person to talk about it. It's sociological. It's very kind of informed by Chesler being a psychologist herself. It's got super duper interview testimony from women who had long-term experience in psychiatric wards and in therapy. Those interviews are absolutely stunning, even today, reading them. But yeah, my background's history, and to be honest, I was really keen on understanding the history of psychiatry as it developed. My sister happens to be a psychiatrist, which doesn't mean that I have any expertise in the area, but I do kind of hear on a weekly basis things coming through from the field of psychiatry, so it makes me interested. But no, actually, I mean, to be boring and nerdy and honest, it was really the history that I was interested in. So yeah, as I was saying, I think, you know, I feel that I don't know how many women here sort of have history as their sort of disciplinary background, but I feel like in radical feminism we don't have enough of it, and I think it's really important, particularly as we find ourselves in this particular historical period facing a major. Obviously, we're facing a, you know, millennia type confrontation in the sexual politics. But that aside, I think history is important at this kind of time for us to learn from. But unfortunately, I feel like we don't have enough radical feminist history to be able to learn the lessons of history. Obviously, Sheila Jeffreys is here with us, and her Spinster and Enemies, Feminism, Sexuality, 1880 to 1930. That book's from 1998. And what Sheila does, I think, is unusually analyse a system of male domination and ideology and rituals and institution of male domination, and how men developed and kind of innovated and renovated these systems so that they defeated the first wave feminists by the First World War. And so I think Sheila Jeffreys kind of periodizes history in a way that's useful to radical feminists, and I don't think we have much of that, but I think we do have it in the female malady. So effectively, I think methodologically, and I don't know whether Sheila Jeffreys would disagree with me, methodologically I think that Showalter undertakes the same thing in relation to psychiatry, even though, like you say, Julia, you don't read her text to get kind of radical feminist political insight. I think we have to do that work through reading her history, but the history is dead on, and it's just stunning. I think, my personal opinion, the sources that she uses and the stories that she tells and the proponents that she describes biographically are utterly stunning, I think, and gives us an idea of how, again, sorry, I keep coming back to it, but that men's systems, the systems that we face that men have been successful in developing now, and one of them being, I think, and we might talk later about the extent to which we now face, you know, this system of sort of psychology and wellness industries as hostile to feminists. They've achieved such success, but they've done a lot of work in order to achieve that, and they weren't necessarily going to achieve it. As we'll talk about in a minute, Showalter shows us that there were historical periods when they looked like they were losing in terms of developing the very profession of psychiatry, and it was always going to be historically contingent. They did win to some greater or lesser extent in terms of developing the profession, but women resisted them. The first wave feminists certainly did, and maybe, once we reflect on the fact that it was so touch and go as to whether psychiatry was going to end up developed as a profession, that why now we've lost a lot of the feminist critique that was fantastic in, you know, the 80s and 90s against, you know, things like psychiatry and psychology and the whole wellness industry that we have now. So history's my thing, and that's why
Thanks, Carol. I don't know. I anticipate there's going to be huge interest in this topic, and I think it would be great to look at some other texts as well. You know, we've got a few. I'm sure women in the chat are going to suggest, you know, others. That I was thinking of, you know, the brilliant Changing Our Minds book by I think it's Kitzinger and Perkins, isn't it? That came out in the early 90s. There's quite a few I think that we could talk about, and I really have the sense. I think it has been. I don't know, from my perspective, unless I've missed something, I think it has been a really neglected area for radical feminist scholarship over the past, I don't know, probably 20 years or so. And we were talking about this yesterday, weren't we? That in a way, I think that's quite understandable, because radical feminist perspectives and scholarship has really been pretty much pushed out of academia over that period of time. So I think what we have is something that has then ended up focusing on obviously really, really crucial, important issues like pornography, prostitution, you know, some of the kind of more obvious forms of male violence against women. But I think this kind of scholarship, you know, where we had work on all, you know, different aspects of women's lives, including things like, you know, psychiatry and, you know, psychology as, you know, models of social control, you know, that kind of thing. That has obviously been marginalized because women's studies was pretty much eliminated and replaced with gender studies, and we all know the trajectory from there. But it seems to me that there is really a renewed interest in this. I don't want to really say anything too specific about it, but I hope that among the participants we've got some of the women who are really informed about this, you know, very, very informed and politicized around this. And I know that there is kind of new work starting to happen in this area from a more activist perspective as well. So hopefully this will help to contribute and, you know, revitalize this as an area for absolutely for kind of, you know, feminist scholarship and activism. So where's my agenda? So what I thought we'd do was you very kindly agreed to give if you could just really just a few sentences, a very brief overview of the book, so that women who aren't familiar with it will get a flavour of what the book covers. And then we've divided, because the book is divided into, I've got some pop up on my screen, because the book is divided into these three sections of psychiatric Victorianism, psychiatric Darwinism and psychiatric modernism. We've agreed to give a brief overview of each of those sections. So if you could begin with the general overview, and then we'll do our overviews of each section, and hopefully by then it will have introduced lots of rich areas of discussion and questions and things like that, and then we'll come on to the questions at the end.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to what women have to say too, by the way. And I know that there will be women listening whose topic area is this one. So looking forward to the expertise coming through. And I'm certainly not a topic area expert at all in this area. It's just the history that I was keen on. But nonetheless, I hope I can just give a broad summary for all of us listening on the sidelines. So obviously, from the title, as you can see, Elaine Showalter's book is about specifically English origins of the profession of psychiatry and approaches to madness between the years 1830 and 1980. Mentioned specifically the country because England has a different history in relation to psychiatry than other countries do. So some of the things we'll discuss here obviously we can't automatically assume that the same thing was going on in America, because it wasn't. It was specifically English. Now, she starts at 1830, but the pre-1830 world in the 18th century was one of this kind of woman in the mad woman in the attic, the madman in chains, locked up as a brute, seen as animalistic, and sort of locked up and thrown away the key. That was kind of the pre-19th century world. But we start in a different world as we get into psychiatric Victorianism, which Julie will speak about, so I won't go over that. Her thesis of the whole book is slightly different from Chesler, just for those women who know Women and Madness. So in contrast to Chesler, Showalter's overall thesis is that mad women, so-called, escape one specific intolerable exercise of women's wrongs, and this is, she's referring to sort of lashing out against others violently as a result of mental distress. So they escape that state by assuming an idealized, poetic form of femininity as the male culture has construed it, absolutely irrational, absolutely emotional, and absolutely passive. So I think even though we don't get that kind of hard-hitting radical feminist political analysis from Showalter from this book, if you read carefully, we do kind of get huge insights like this one, where she effectively, as far as I can read it, understands the construction of madness as femininity. So speaking in Sheila Jeffreys's terms, deference, femininity, exercise of, you know, women's class behaviour is also, according to Showalter, Sheila's telling the slow down, and indeed I should slow down. So Showalter is saying that what's called the old nervous disorders, which is in today's language, the mood disorders, they're actually constructed in a way that women and girls exercise them as behaviours of femininity. So people like Chesler and others would sort of see sort of engagement in psychiatry and, you know, women's diagnoses of various mood disorders and things as kind of, you know, a way to escape the binds of femininity and women's constrained position and inability to, you know, act as normal human beings in society because we are relegated to this feminine role. But Showalter is kind of also almost upside down on that. So she thinks that it's a framework constructed over time such that it ends up being women's expected and preferred exercise of femininity. So that's kind of the thesis of the book, even though we go through various periods of it. Maybe I'll stop there so we can get into the detail.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. So yes, so I'm going to talk about the first section of the book, which Showalter heads Psychiatric Victorianism. And in this section, it consists of 3 chapters: domesticating insanity, the rise of the figure of the Victorian madwoman, and some of the practices that were used to kind of manage the female insanity that these male psychiatrists were diagnosing. And what Showalter identifies as what she calls the 3 cornerstones of Victorian psychiatric theory and practice were the development of the idea of moral insanity, which then needs a moral management, and within the framework of what she calls moral architecture. So she says that these things, moral insanity, moral management, and moral architecture, are the 3 cornerstones of the developing psychiatric theory and practice. And as Caroline already sort of referred to, the historical period that she treats begins in the mid-19th century, where we see this shift from these earlier ideas of madness as a complete sort of departure from reason, something that was kind of inherently brutish and violent and needed to be met with force and restraint, needed to be met with violence in order to kind of restrain and contain it. So we see the sort of earlier period of, you know, the Bedlam Asylum as being sort of exemplary of the way that these ideas of madness had been conceptualized and also then treated very much through restraint, force, you know, all the different horrible sort of instruments of restraint that I think I'm going to talk a bit about those later. And then in sort of at this period, she opens the book with a description of this new asylum. I think it's in somewhere in North London, called Colney Hatch, and I believe this building, I'm pretty sure it's still there, and it's now actually as we could all completely have predicted, it's now very exclusive apartments. Of course, it's been converted into these, you know, quite luxurious and exclusive apartments. But anyway, Connolly Hatch was this new asylum that symbolized the new approach to managing insanity. But I'll come on to talk about that. So basically, there was a redefinition of madness, not as a loss of reason, but as deviance from socially accepted behaviors. And there was also begin understand kind of a diagnosis of this moral insanity as not just being its absence of reason, but as having moral causes of things like emotional catalysts or psychological stresses, but also things like social causes such as, you know, poverty and deprivation. So you get this guy, some doctor called something Davy, talking about the causes of insanity as being the 3 W's: worry, want, and wickedness, that should be treated with the 3 M's: method, meat, and morality. So we really see quite a development here, this sort of growth of some kind of understanding of, they wouldn't have called it psychological distress, but maybe we would call it mental distress now. The causes of that and the different methods for it. So there was this shift away from this kind of bedlam model of restraint. We've got the appearance of these new asylums, such as this Connolly Hatch asylum, which opened in 1851, with a very elaborate Italianate facade. It was very ornate. It was really extensive. It was, I think, set in very sort of an idyllic setting, and this was quite typical of these new buildings and the new architecture, where what had previously been physical and forceful restraint was actually being replaced by surveillance under the sort of rubric of care, and the idea of the director of the asylum as being the friend to all the residents. There was obviously still notions of kind of restraint and containment, but this was done through surveillance. And some of the asylums were actually built on that panopticon model, which obviously has been made famous, the Bentham model of surveillance. And the focus was on moral management of this moral insanity, through creating an atmosphere of calmness, of some degree of comfort and care, and the inculcation of appropriate kind of habits and activities that would basically deal with the sort of deviance by creating a kind of conducive context for kind of socially acceptable behaviours. But the asylums were obviously very much built on this household model, with the male head, often his wife would be the matron, and then there would be the attendants, the staff, and then the patients would be kind of in the role of the children who were being sort of managed and treated within this. So there was a combination of care, order, and a focus on habits and activities. And the main figure who was associated with this was this guy called John Connolly, who became the director of the Hanwell Asylum from 1839 to 3. And we have to acknowledge that it wasn't a huge achievement in that asylum. They did get rid of all the manacles and the chains and the fetters, etc., and stopped using those. But as Showalter documents, the idea that it was this kind of, family based on egalitarianism and mutual friendship was obviously somewhat at odds with the very hierarchical structure of it, and the fact that as you get this shift to moral management, you also get a feminization of the residents, because she says that beforehand there were more males in the asylums than females, and this changes, and at the same time you get a masculinization of the management structures. So whereas before you might have had had women running sort of independent, smaller establishments, that was gradually sort of phased out, and you had men really assuming charge. So you get all the male discourse around identifying the causes of madness, and I can't go into all of them now, but the causes of this moral insanity. But obviously there was, in terms of women, there was a huge focus on women's nervous system and reproductive systems as making women particularly vulnerable to insanity. So there was a focus.
Not until the Darwinist phase, though, maybe. I mean, I think Showalter kind of is keen to put that in the next section, but but so it does come through.
Yeah, she does talk about that even beforehand, and some of the really grim methods that were used by men to try to delay the onset of menstruation or to address problems of the menopause. And she also talks about the use of female genital, she calls it clitoridectomy, now we'd call it female genital mutilation, and the really sort of distressing, she talks about some of the really horrific attempts by men to control what they saw as the kind of inherent problems of female reproduction that could lead to insanity. She just briefly then, she also talks about the representation of insanity in novels and diaries written by women, because obviously the patients in these places didn't have a voice. The voice was all that of the male doctors and psychiatrists, discussing them, taking photographs of them, analysing the photographs. They were very much objectified like that. So she turns to things like writings of Charlotte Bronte and various other, Florence Nightingale as well, to get a kind of a women's insight into the social reasons why women might end up in these places. So I hope that gives a bit of a flavour. It was the moral insanity, moral architecture and moral management that she really talks about in this first section.
Exactly, and I think that's the crucial thing for us now looking back, that we need to remember that the understanding of, if we call it mental distress, I don't know what to call it because they didn't use those words, but if we just whatever, that thing that we're referring to, madness, obviously as you've been saying, wasn't considered one of psychology. So the idea of us psychology that's separate from the body or separate from the being hadn't developed by that point. So it was sort of very behavioural, wasn't it? So work systems and structured institutional living and moral guidance and so social reform. As you've been saying, the social reformers to some small extent did create some good conditions for a very small slice in historical time for women to seek refuge in some of these asylums. But that, like you're saying, it was quickly overtaken by kind of more Darwinist ideas. So I think my next section deals with the Psychiatric Darwinism from 1870 to 1920. And this is Showalter's biggest section of the book. And this is where she suggests that any promise of decent, humane conditions and institutions for women to seek refuge from distresses of all kind in the family, mental, were defeated. She says they were defeated, firstly, because of changed historical conditions economically, the Depression, unemployment, the perceived threat from socialist uprising in the world. Those kind of external conditions meant that men kind of doubled down on their power bases within England. The asylums were obviously expensive and boutique and not able to handle the kinds of numbers, and the numbers were coming from women. So we have to remember from, like you said, Julia, from this period, they were overwhelmed with women patients specifically and have always been so. And so they turned to institutional models that could handle those kind of numbers, which were not, obviously they didn't deal with women as individuals or face-to-face, that kind of thing. So we're moving into psychiatric Darwinism, but obviously at the heart of this are ideas of eugenics. So Showalter writes that this second generation of 19th century physicians, so the generation that came after the John Connolly, and it's actually, she centres this chapter around John Connolly's son-in-law, Henry Maudsley, who's the villain of the book. John Connolly is a bit of a nice, she paints him quite nicely, doesn't she? So this second generation of 19th century physicians, represented by Maudsley, were inspired by Darwinian theories of evolution in geology, biology, and the social sciences. and they sought to apply rigorous scientific methods to the study of insanity rather than rely any longer on the vague humanitarian sympathies and administrative reforms of their predecessors, because that was the social reformers. They insisted that insanity had a physical cause. So it's at this point in history that we shift from moral kind of understandings, behavioural guidance type understandings of whatever it is, mental distress, madness, shifting in now to it being a physical complaint. This was a big, big innovation. Mm-hmm. And as a result, physical treatments started to come in, the horrors of physical treatments. Mm-hmm. So they insisted that insanity had a physical cause that could be discovered by a sophisticated medical practice. Their focus was on laws of selection and survival, which they believed operated as strongly in the mental world as in the social world. Darwinism emphasised the hereditary disposition to madness and the congenital inferiority of the insane. Madness was the mark of the impotent and the unfit, the sign of social, intellectual and moral decline. So it was, in this historical period, madness was considered to be a disorder of the brain, and that did have one small innovative good outcome, and that was the connection of syphilis to brain disease. So that's one thing, but the rest of the history of this period is pretty horrifying. This is when the asylums developed into the houses of horror that we perhaps think of today, the sort of the 18th century type idea, except on a larger scale. And it's also the time in which that idea that Julia mentioned about madness being connected to women's reproductive and nervous systems, like in a physical sense, that idea solidified. And as a result, like Julia said, they had the so-called clitoridectomy procedures. This was the period, electricity was used during this period, straitjackets, the horrors of asylums came to the fore. It was very physical, and I think this is something as I've emphasised, of this period. So madness was linked to physical features. So they attempted to assess people's bodily characteristics in order to uncover what they considered to be latent madness. So everyone, and there's another, I'll move on to a different discussion about the consolidation of the psychiatric profession during this time, but the psychiatric profession kind of put the scares on everyone through creating this idea that there's such a thing as latent madness that could be detected through assessment of, facial features or physical features. As I said, and Julia mentioned too, that this was the period in which men consolidated their position as proponents of the profession of psychiatry. So up until now, men, as Julia said, were overseeing asylums, and they were physicians, so part of the medical fraternity, but they were low down in the pecking order of the medical fraternity because they were associated with this kind of pastoral care guidance type model from the Victorian era. And so they overthrew that kind of association for themselves in order to elevate their status within the medical profession as a proper proponents of psychiatry. And they did that through physicalising, so giving a real physical basis to madness, because medicine was equated with physicians and the attendants to medical attendants to the body, and so that the more that they were able to link this madness with the body and physical things, then the higher up in the medical profession they went, and that's how they did it. So this is sort of the emergence of the profession of psychiatry, which I thought was really interesting. Now the second half of this section, Showalter moves on to discuss the application of Darwinistic ideas of madness to women specifically, and this comes out in the concept of hysteria. And she says that hysteria was most strongly identified with the feminist movement. Darwinian psychiatry undoubtedly intimidated many feminists with its prophecies of hysterical breakdown for women who transgressed their destined roles. So this was the latent madness that psychiatrists were apparently able to detect in people. So that's, and as Julie mentioned, the professionalisation of psychiatry in this particular historical period had an effect on women's experience of psychiatry, as men came to take less caring roles or pastoral care type roles and more ones of a bureaucratic medicalised management. So because of eugenics and those ideas that mad people, so designated mad people, were degenerates and had problems of in their hereditary backgrounds, had problems of poverty that were caused by their dispositions and their compositions as individuals. And if you look into the history of eugenics, it's extraordinary, because that also transitioned into ideas about interacting with these people could mean somehow that you too were sort of almost infected by them. There was ideas like that going around. So Showalter makes the comment that these managers of asylums ended up having no contact with any of their inmates because of this sort of the strong eugenicist Darwinistic ideas that came with them. So that's, I hope, some kind of small so the horrors of that period, I'll just quickly mention them. So obviously anorexia was categorised in 1873, hysteria in the 1870s as well, and also another nervous disorder called neurasthenia, which is sort of today's depression, roughly, in the 1870s as well. Except, don't forget, so these are not, at the time, they're not, as we understand them today, to be mood disorders. Rather, they're disorders of the nervous system and the reproductive system, and therefore, and they had physical origins, and therefore the treatment of them were physical, so electricity, forced feeding, rest cure, by the way. I might talk about that one later. That's quite an interesting one that Virginia Woolf and Charlotte Perkins Gilman also experienced. Clitoridectomy, and the idea was that the patient needed to completely submit to the doctor's authority, and that was a means of treatment.
Okay, thanks. I realise time's kind of racing ahead. Caroline, did you want to say something about the final section, the anti-psychiatry movement, or maybe I know we want to have a bit of time for discussion, but
we do. Sorry, yes, I've dragged on far too well. I'll quickly mention. So
I think particularly all the anti-psychiatry. If you've got anything, any sort of notes on that, I think it would be interesting, and maybe lead into a discussion from that.
Yeah. Sorry, everyone. I know everyone else has got much more important things to discuss. So from 1920 to the 1980s, we move into a wholly different period, as this will be much more familiar to women listening today. But probably what we can get from Showalter's book is the very interesting and I think unknown insight. The historical insight was that the defeat of psychiatric Darwinism occurred unfortunately not because first wave feminists succeeded. They did struggle against psychiatric Darwinism. They criticised the doctors, they criticised the way the asylums were run. They were defeated, but psychiatric Darwinism itself too was defeated, but it was defeated by the tens of thousands of men coming back from the First World War into the military hospitals and into English society with so-called shell shock, which is today we would understand to be post-traumatic stress disorder, I think they call it in today's terms. And I probably didn't say this enough, but so psychiatric Darwinism obviously understood madness to be a sexed phenomenon, whereby women could experience it because of their reproductive and nervous systems, but men could not, at least the nervous disorder side, the hysteria side. But then when we have the tens of thousands of men coming back from the First World War, the psychiatric Darwinists couldn't reconcile their symptoms because they were displaying the exact same so-called hysteria that the women were displaying, except even more severe sometimes, and in their tens and thousands. And so they did try to hold on to those horrific physical treatments of the men coming back from war in the first couple of years, but then couldn't keep it up. They just couldn't maintain their obviously flawed concept of psychiatry in the face of all of these men coming back. It was completely at odds with what they'd theorised and everything they'd done up until that point. So they lost, they were defeated. And that brings in the era of psychiatric modernism, as Julia was saying, and this is, I've got a two-track, I promise I'll be quick. This is a two-track development in history. One is very good. I mean, obviously we've got much, criticism to say about Freud and psychoanalysis and all of that. There's no endorsing it, but compared to psychiatric Darwinism, it was a major development of the talking cure for nervous disorders. And these were, characterised as anorexia, hysteria, neurasthenia. And so we go on one track over to the continent in the psychoanalysis field. So we get rid of, we start to understand madness as a psychological or a mental phenomenon and no longer the physical one. And so the talking cures, because the talking treatments become the treatments for that. So we get away from the horrors of the physical treatments. However, at the same time, that's also when the field of psychiatry identifies a biological basis to certain disorders, namely schizophrenia. And so it develops on a two-track path here. And here we have insulin shock, electric treatment, and shock treatment, of course, drugs, and all of that for what's being diagnosed as having a biological basis. And obviously we still have this legacy continuing up until the current day. Then, as Julia mentioned, and I know Sheila Jeffries will know a lot about this as well, from 1960, and for a brief period of time, though, it was only a decade, we had the anti-psychiatry movement develop in the US, and that found an entirely sociological basis to madness and attempt to develop kind of institutions and responses on that basis. But Showalter is very critical of the anti-psychiatry movement as we had it under Artie Lang, and Artie Lang, I think, is treated, is written up biographically quite well by Showalter and sympathetically, but kind of the movement that he represents in the 1960s, Showalter analyses as fundamentally sexist, slightly exploitative of female patients, and so it's a brief period of time, but I think as radical feminists, all of us know that the critiques that were made of psychiatry during that particular time by the New Left, we now inherited into the 1990s, even though it's probably waned a little bit within our analysis today. At least we still have those important ideas, even if they need feminist development.
Yeah, I think I can't remember if she exactly speaks about this in that section, but I think it's really important to remember that, and I'm sure there are other women who know more about this than me. I think the anti-psychiatry movement, it kind of continued in some ways, sort of, well beyond that 10-year period. From what I understand, it, in some maybe kind of slightly more, limited ways. But I think from that era that she's talking about, obviously that was very much the time of, all these sort of new social movements, the so-called sexual revolution, and, and so all of that kind of very misogynist kind of sexist cultures of those, of some of those movements then just, I think, did get replicated within the anti-psychiatry, because it would all be very much seen as part of that kind of counterculture, wider set of movements. I don't know, do you think, Caroline? It seems to me that it's not really surprising that the kind of sexism and objectification of women that she talks about there, it was very much, we can see that across the board in those kind of leftist movements and the sexual revolution at the time. Exactly.
And I think as radical feminists, we were robbed by those new left movements, unknowingly, by the fact that we don't today have feminist institutional sort of feminist facilities and institutions that are for women's, to escape to suffering mental distress. We've got, domestic violence crisis centres, things like women's bookshops, other kind of institutions, which is great. But I think, well, this is my speculation. I'd love to hear what women say, but that kind of new left neoliberalism that's quickly transitioned into neoliberalism, and the deinstitutionalisation specifically of people, diagnosed, with mental distress. Sure, I'm sure, yes, there are reasons for it, but then again, as Showalter says, and I have to agree with her, that pushed a big burden onto the family. And when we talk about the family, it's always women. And so the deinstitutionalisation movement that I think was a big part of the new left, I feel like, robbed feminists of the idea that we needed to autonomously set up our own facilities and institutions for, women in mental distress. These are needed, just like domestic violence shelters are needed. But and I don't think I'm not saying it's our fault that we didn't end up with them either. I think it's sort of a real anti-institution, new left type idea that we still hang around with today with the neoliberalism we're with.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think that brings us on. I know we've only got about 10 minutes left now. Maybe if anyone can put in the Q&A any particular things that have come up in the chat, because I haven't been able to keep track of it. But I mean, one of the reasons I was really, really pleased that you'd chosen this book is because of this kind of this burgeoning discourse around so-called like mental health that we're seeing at the moment. It's quite a phenomenon. I don't know that there's been very much written from a radical feminist perspective on it, but certainly mental health seems to be like one of the sort of causes of the day, doesn't it? That barely a week goes by without some sort of news feature or member of, in this country, like the member of the royal family, the various princes or talking about it, and it's what's interesting to me is that it's become such a kind of catch-all thing that it's become it's become a kind of an okay thing to talk about. Like when I was growing up, there was such a stigma around any kind of what would be seen as like mental health or mental distress, in your family, or if you were experiencing anything like that, there was such a stigma, whereas now it's almost obligatory to talk about our experience in terms of mental health. And there's such a sort of medicalization of experience. We were talking yesterday a bit, weren't we, about the kind of medicalization of the menopause. Now there's a really big sort of discourse around that. And I mentioned the conference that I went to about 10 years ago after the summer of riots in the UK that was catalysed by the police shooting of a man called Mark Duggan in Tottenham in North London. And that incident then catalysed a series of riots which lasted for about 5 days, with kind of violence, arson, looting, real kind of civil unrest in a lot of the major cities of the UK. And then I went to this conference after a year after that, where the various great and good who'd been doing stuff about it were talking about what projects they'd been involved in. And I was really quite shocked to see that so much of the investment in there, not that there was a huge amount of investment, but had gone into kind of psychological interventions and projects. And so there were just all these people from psychology and therapy on the stage talking about conduct disorder, behavioral disorder, and it just seemed to me that there was oppositional disorder, all these different disorders that were being identified, and this kind of very, very small scale interventions as a way that we were supposed to think is an appropriate response to obviously huge social and political factors and questions. So I think that it's become an okay thing to talk about everything in terms of mental health and psychology and disorders, and to kind of claim a diagnosis for all these different things. So I don't know. And
the thread of this, I see it in Australia too. And the thread of this, I think, is that we are not getting away from women as the mad ones. So yes, these hands are extended to young guys, in council estates, under the guise of counselling or whatever else. But that doesn't get us away from women's fundamental social constructions of class as mad. We're not the reliable ones, men are. And we've seen, I think, with the current transgenderist push, is that men can say the craziest things, that proposition, that's a crazy proposition, and they're entirely reasonable, they're rational, they retain that status, that social status as a class. We can say the entirely rational and reasonable thing, and we're mad and crazy and need to be shot as TERFs or whatever they say. So it's just, I know this is getting too philosophical for the content, but my view is that we absolutely need to oppose any of this type mood disorders, personality disorders. I do think that drugs can certainly help schizophrenia and other disorders. I think we should rely on them when we can. I think we should absolutely oppose any idea of there being a psychology, because as long as we uphold those kind of concepts of psychology, and all the nervous disorders and depressions and anorexia and all the rest of it, then we're retaining this women's class status as the mad ones. And we're doing ourselves in for future political activity. I think it's got to be political or nothing, I think is my view.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when I was working in the women's sector, it was seen as like one of the things that you would offer, that would be offered to a woman who either, you know, experienced male sexual violence, domestic violence, you know, often not really distinguishable, would be, you know, various supports, like does she, you know, does she want sort of housing support? Does she want, you know, legal support? And then some sort of counselling or group work. There's been this whole growth of this sort of group work as well, would be seen as one of the things that automatically would be offered. And I mean, I have to say, I cannot understand, in the absence of anything else, like, you know, I don't know, I can see why that is the case, but I think it really reflects a complete sort of depoliticization of what those original women's groups and organizations have been set up to do, you know, that that she would be offered this kind of very individual whatever support, if you can call it that, but what she wouldn't ever really encounter on a sort of journey through that, you know, sort of support package from a women's sector organization would be any kind of political or feminist understanding of where she was, or, you know, those kind of tools to understand that. It's all been replaced by, as you say, this very sort of neoliberal, you know, you've had this, what's happened, you know, what this man has done to you has had an impact on your confidence, your self-esteem, and these are the things that have to be rebuilt through this kind of package. So I think we're kind of coming up to time, and I think that we've hopefully opened a rich seam of all the, you know, these topics for discussion, and I really hope this is going to be taken up in future sessions, and also in you know, in what I'm just starting to detect is some of the renewed activism around this area. Shall we have a quick look at the Q&A just to see if there's anything we can address? I think it's kind of comments really about
Julia Beck's got a nice question about Eastern medicine recognising the human body as a living thing, rather than Western medicine understanding it as a dead thing. It's not a thought that I've considered before, but that does sound interesting to think about. In Japan, I can't comment more than that. Sorry, Julia. In Japan, there's a very strong resistance to Western medicine here. So, you know, even sort of normal medical kind of checks and procedures and endoscopies and things like that, they won't use any anaesthetic at all and that kind of thing. And illegal drugs don't circulate, and drugs, in fact, psychiatric drugs too are not used to any great extent. So yeah, there's definitely a difference, I notice, at least in Japan.
I'm really frustrated that we haven't really got time for any discussion now. I mean, maybe we could suggest a few books that women, if they're not already familiar with, might want to have a look at. This one I think is brilliant, For Her Own Good, by Erin Reich in English. I think that came out even before the Showalter piece. Maybe this is something that we could go back to. And I think the Changing Our Minds, I think, would be a great book to look at in future sessions. And maybe also the Phyllis Chesler one we might want to return to.
Women in Madness from 1973.
Yep. So yeah, I don't know, are there any final words you'd like to say, Caroline?
Apologies to women in the chat. I think both Julia and me were looking at your comments as they came through, and I apologise. It was my fault for speaking too much. I didn't get you guys enough chance to chat in the comment box. So sorry, everyone. But we can see your great comments.
Yeah, Caroline, no need to apologise at all. I think your input was just really helpful, and I think it's really whetted the appetite for women to read the Showalter. I mean, because we were giving a summary of it, we weren't really able to go into huge. You know, she gives so much detail, doesn't she? And some of the photographs that she includes I've just found so moving. Of, you know, because these women were objectified in these places, and so you have the doctors all talking about them, but when you actually, I don't know, I just felt like looking at the women's eyes, there were all these stories behind them that you would love to have heard about, but obviously they had no voice. So apart from anything else, it is a really, really moving and, you know, at times moving, at times really horrifying account of what, you know, women experienced throughout that period. And it definitely speaks to, you know, what some of the, you know, sort of similarities and parallels that we can find now. So I think we're going to wrap up there. Thank you, everyone. I'm looking forward to
thanks to you, Julia.
Later. And thank you so much, Caroline, for your suggestion and your really brilliant presentation on Showalter's work. Thanks.
No, great to be in your presence.
Okay, all right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
See you next time. Bye.